One of the dear friends of mine, Dr. E.N. Paulson, entered heaven in 2017. Now, you probably have never heard of him, but the world tempts us to trust just about anything or anyone except God. And yet God provides us rare examples of people who are really steadfast in their faith. And Dr. Paulson was a mentor to me for some first 27 years in Singapore. An amazing man. He arrived in Singapore 17 March 1953, before most of us were born. He came as a missionary to Indonesia, stopped over in Singapore to wait for his visa. Well, he waited 64 years for his visa. And God brought him into glory on 13th of October 2017. After 64 years, he was still in Singapore. Dr. P, as he's affectionately known, established the School of Theology English at Singapore Bible College, which is the school I have been teaching at since 1991, where I have the privilege of teaching students from all over Asia in English, even though my students speak 45 languages that I have on my website right now. I have the privilege of teaching them in English, and Dr. Paulson was a fellow American like me. He actually served at Singapore Bible College 5 years before I was born, 1958. That's when the school actually began, and the English school in 1958. And he was in Singapore 5 years before I came around the scene. And ironically, he was asked to teach the Chinese how to speak Indonesian. That was his first job. As an American, you as an American teach the Chinese to speak Indonesian. Well, anyway, he served at the college till 1988 for 36 years actually, total. And I told him that one of my goals in my life was to beat him. One of my goals is to serve longer than 36 years, so I could be the one who serves at the Bible college longer than any of the other foreigners. Kind of a carnal goal, you might say, and that'll happen if I can serve there another 8 or 10 years till I'm 70 years old. So we'll see. We'll see if it happens. He actually never intended to retire, and so Dr. Paulson never did. He even taught a Tuesday night Bible study every Tuesday night all the way until he was 91 years old, until 3 days before he entered heaven. That's how he wanted to enter heaven, teaching, steadfast. When I think of words that describe Dr. Paulson, the key one that comes to my mind is steadfast, unmoving. He was my pastor for the first 10 years in Singapore, but he stayed in touch, of course, in the 17 years since then. And he was a great example to me of one who was to be steadfast in putting his trust in the Lord. You can see where I'm going with this. So where are you putting your trust? Is my question. Do you have an immovable trust in God? What is it going to take for you to be derailed from your faith in the Lord Jesus? Ever thought about that? God wants you to be steadfast, but what would it take for you not to be steadfast? What does it take for you to be secure, feel secure with the Lord and feel secure with what God is doing in your life? Some years ago, one of our students, professional students at the college, told one of my colleagues who was teaching her, she wanted to become a missionary. And he said, fantastic. We would love to help you do whatever we can for you to become a missionary. What do you need? And she said, well, I'm getting the training I need. I just need to have more of like a bank account balance that I can fall back on. Some savings. And that didn't sound too unreasonable. The Bible tells us to save, right? To have some savings. He said, well, how much do you think you really need to have in the bank before you can become a missionary? And without batting an eye, she said, $1 million. As soon as I'm a millionaire, I will be really available to the Lord. Well, that was about 20 years ago. I haven't heard from her. I don't know who she is. My guess, as you could probably imagine, is she's probably not a missionary. Probably trying to still get up to that $1 million. And it caused me to kind of wonder, well, where's my self-worth? Where does it come from? So that I feel like I could really be steadfast. Is it my occupation? Is it my social standing? Is it my national identity? What is it for you? Where do you really get your self-worth? Where do you place your faith? Do you place your faith in the scientists and the philosophers and the media personalities or wealthy people? Or do you place your faith in the Lord? I would say if you're placing your faith anywhere else, you're really not going to be able to be steadfast. So who is the king, the boss in your life that's worthy of your trust? And you know, of course, what I'm going to say. Be steadfast in your trust in the Lord. The Webster's Dictionary defines steadfast as firmly fixed in place, immovable, not subject to change. Being steadfast means being immovable from your place. You hold your ground in what God has told you to do and His calling for your life. And we all know people who have not been steadfast, like Dr. Polson. 64 years as a missionary. Have you ever heard of anyone who's been a missionary 64 years? That's the longest I've ever heard. Maybe there are some who have served longer than that. But why? Why must we be steadfast? We know we should, right? Why must we be steadfast in having God as our king? Having God as the one who's really ruling our lives. That's really what we're going to talk about as we move on into the next book, the book of Joshua, the book of Judges from the book of Joshua. And the background to understand what is in store for the people in the book of Judges is the land that was settled under Joshua. I didn't show you a map of the actual land that was settled, but this one is a pretty good one because it shows everything that's dark is the land that was settled by the time we get to the end of Joshua. So this is the beginning of the book of Judges. The conquest and the settlement under Joshua actually did not cover the coastal areas, except for just tiny little spots here. It didn't cover the flat farming area of the north. It didn't cover the area around the Sea of Galilee. And it certainly didn't cover farther south than Beersheba, all the way down to Kadesh Barnea. And yet the allotments that God gave to the people was the ideal. God said, here are the places for all the tribes, even though they had not actually conquered those areas yet. They had, by the time we get to the time of Judges, they had the 5 books of Moses, and they had the book of Joshua. They had 6 books available to them. And the question now is, well, what would they do with those books? What would they do with the written revelation of God that was being copied, and was it being taught to the people enough? Well, I think probably we would say no. The Levites were spread throughout the land, in the land that was conquered. And the Levites, their responsibility was to teach the people and to live close to the tribes. You'll remember the Levites did not receive an allotment of land that was separate, like one of these areas. God didn't want to put all the teachers all in one area. Do you see a good principle there? Now, most of the people that I have the privilege of ministering to are teachers, people like you. Most people don't want to have me teach them unless they want to teach it to someone else. And I commend you for your desire to be what you might call a modern-day Levite, one of God's Levitical teachers investing God's word in people. Now the question would be, what would those Levites do? And what will you do? Will you be steadfast in fulfilling the calling that God has put in your hands. My summary for the book of Judges is this phrase, failure, under the theocracy. In other words, God was still king. It was a theocracy. They still had not moved into the time of the kings. This is not a monarchy yet. God is still the king. But God being the king doesn't work unless the people are willing to be steadfast in his word. And what we find here in our threefold division as we look into the book of Judges is that there was an incomplete occupation. They didn't conquer all the land. And this is reviewed for us in the first part of the book up to chapter 2, verse 5. And because there was an incomplete occupation, there were enemies around. And so God delivered the people at various times through judges in the bulk of the book, chapter 2:6 up to 16:31. These were deliverers of God who were regional deliverers in various parts around Israel. And yet the fact that they had to keep doing it over and over again show that they were failing under the theocracy. And the final few chapters, 17 to 21, highlight the need for a monarchy. It highlights the need for a king, which will bring us to our key verse I'll show you in a minute. So the deterioration of the incomplete occupation caused the cycles where the people were living with the Canaanites. And so God disciplined them. And frankly, we've got the curse of the cycles. They just kept going in and out of sin here. And they were at war with the Canaanites as a result. And finally, when we get to the end of the book, it's a 5-chapter summary of the most gross chapters you'll find in the Bible. Depravity, with the conditions of the cycles being just utter chaos, immorality, and these are the saddest chapters in the Bible, where they're living like the Canaanites. Living with them led to war with them, but they ended up capitulating and living like them. The whole book doesn't have a geographical movement. It's all in Canaan, and it takes place in about 341 years. And I believe the book of Judges answers this question: why must you be steadfast in having God as your king? They were under the theocracy, but they weren't steadfast in doing it. And today we're going to see 3 reasons to place God as king. To really live as if God is the boss of your life. And here's the first reason. Incomplete obedience plants the seeds for failure. When we say, Lord, I'll be obeying in this area, but not in this area, in other words, we have incomplete obedience, it just plants the seeds for failure. We see this in the first couple chapters where we're rejecting God's lordship over their lives through disobeying him as king, because he was the king. It just led to trouble. It just led to difficulty. And so we see in the first chapter up to 2:5, Israel's incomplete occupation of Canaan led to the need for judges. They needed judges because they weren't obedient. And so God raised up different men, mostly, and with a few women, who did not do what we normally think of judges today, who are, civil magistrates who just render judgments in cases. Rather, these judges are different than what we would normally use the word today. They were deliverers of God's people, primarily, and then they did administer justice after that. So in Judges 1, we see, for example, that the people are spread throughout the land. They have their allotments, but they haven't actually conquered all the land that we see on a map here. And they needed to move out. Now, I'm going to give a grade to each one of these. The first one is going to get an A. Okay? Judah, after the death of Joshua, the first verse of Judges says, the Israelites asked the Lord, who will be the first to go up and fight for us against the Canaanites? And the Lord answered, Judah is to go. I've given the land into their hands. And the men of Judah said to the Simeonites, their brothers, come with us in the territory allotted to us to fight against the Canaanites. We in turn will go with you into yours. And so the Simeonites went with them. And when Judah attacked, the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they struck down 10,000 men at Bezek. It was there that they found Adonai-Bezek and fought against him, to rout the Canaanites and Perizzites. So they have victory. They got an A. God told them, step out in faith and do it. Conquer your regional area. They didn't tell the people of Judah, go conquer the people way up in the north. That was not their responsibility. It was their responsibility to conquer the people that are right in their area. Simeonites get an A as well, because they helped the Judites, and the Judites helped the Simeonites. But when you go on, though, and you read about what happened after that, we end up seeing, an F. Because later on, they don't really trust the Lord. And I don't have the time to go into all this, because this would be actually one good sermon here, Judges 1. But as you go through, you'll see the people of Benjamin will get an F. Ephraim, hey, they did pretty well. They get an A. The people of Manasseh, I'm going to give them a D. And then an F for the Ephraimites, who previously had an A. The people of Zebulun get a D. And I guess you can tell I'm a professor, right? I'm giving everybody a grade here, huh? It's really a mixed bag. It's mostly A's and F's. And the Levites are actually not involved in doing all that. But when you see that many F's with very few A's, you're really not going to pass the course, are you? And so our key word for the book of Judges is actually the word failure. They had some successes, but mostly they really were not doing what they did back in Joshua. They weren't trusting the Lord. And so what we find here is, as I said, the theme is failure under the theocracy. Now, it's not failure of the theocracy. It's not like God failed. But it's a failure under God as king, because they really weren't honoring him. And the key verse, I believe, we see actually twice that begins and ends the last section of the book. Chapter 17, verse 6 and 21:25, the last verse of the book. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. Some of our translations say, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now, notice the two sentences there. Do you see the connection between them? This was not readily apparent to me. In those days, Israel had no king. Okay, I get the idea. They didn't have a king. Everyone did as he saw fit. I didn't see the connection between the two. Why does everybody do as they see fit? Because there's no king. I mean, don't they have the 6 books preceding them, Genesis all the way to Joshua? They did. But one of the key responsibilities of a king was to, if not teach the people himself, make sure that the teachers of the land are inculcating God's values into the people. And frankly, it's the same for those of us who are Christian leaders. I, as a pastor, am ultimately responsible for the teaching ministry of the church. I'm not teaching everybody. I'm not teaching small groups. I'm not teaching the children. I'm not teaching the youth or the young adults. There are other people who are doing that, but ultimately I'm responsible. I'm not the king of the church. I'm the pastor-teacher, which I think you get the idea. So as we get into chapter 2, we see because the people had not conquered those in the land and cleaned the land of the people, then the land was not cleansed of the false gods of the land. We see Baal worship making its way into Israel. We see Dagon worship of the Philistines catching some of the Israelites into its snare. And we see the worship of Ashtaroth, the female deity of the Canaanite pantheon. They're worshiping her as well. And the consequence of breaking the Mosaic covenant of worshiping other gods was that Israel was surrounded by enemies that the Lord raised up against them. And so these various peoples of the land, they end up attacking the Israelites. And I think that the principle here is that disobeying the Lord as king leads to trouble. Now, he is king, whether you and I recognize it or not. But when we don't acknowledge that, we end up with a lot of issues. Incomplete obedience shows that we're trusting something else other than God. And then God seeks to earn our trust by allowing difficulty in our lives. And we see the same sort of thing today. We see relativism, where people today just seem to, it seems like increasingly, even in the church, do what's right in their own eyes. We see relativism when guys like Phil Robertson says gays need to accept Jesus Christ to get to heaven, which is kind of not theologically really correct. And he gets censored, whereas you get M.Div, he orders gays hanged and beheaded and stoned and burned alive, and he's invited to speak at universities. It's not really a consistent standard, is it? Relativism happens because there are absolutely no absolutes. That's what they say. That's what the relatives say. We're positive there's no absolutes. Well, are you absolutely positive? Yes. It's a self-contradicting system. So why must you be steadfast in having God as your king? The first of those reasons is because the incomplete obedience plants the seeds for failure. And here's where we need to look at our lives and say, where am I actually guilty of incomplete obedience, where I'm making excuses that, I don't really need to follow the Lord in this area? That's your weak area. That point is where Satan's going to fight you. That's the kink in your armor. And every one of us needs to know, as my friend Gary, who wrote the book, The Dark Side of Leadership, Gary McIntosh. You better know what your dark side is, where you show incomplete obedience. In other words, you let disobedience in that particular area. It's like having Canaanites in your life that are going to eventually get you. But there's a second reason that we need to embrace God as king, and that's because relativism leads to cycles of sin. We go in circles when we follow our rules instead of God's absolute standards. That's relativism. Everything's just relative. There's no absolutes. When you have that kind of a philosophy, your life is just going to go in cycle after cycle after cycle, and you're not going to see any real consistency in your life. And what we see in the book of Judges is that the judges tried to stop Israel's cycles of sin, to show that God's absolute standards were better than Israel's relative standards. They had relative success, but it's mostly failure. And many have pointed out that in the book of Judges, you actually have a sin cycle that repeats, depending on who you talk to, at least 6 times, 7 times in the book. It starts with the people sin. Normally that's idolatry. They're worshiping some other god. And as a result, they end up serving some nation. God brings a nation in to conquer them. So sin leads to servitude. They get tired of that after a while, and there's their supplication. They cry out to the Lord. And they say, God, help us with this. We're tired of these people ruling over us. We don't want to be servants. We want to be freed from these shackles. And so God provides salvation for them through a judge, through a deliverer who conquers those enemies and helps them turn their eyes back to the Lord. And then there's a period of silence that typically lasts for a few years. But unfortunately, during that time of silence, there's nothing that they need to trust the Lord for, or at least they think so. And they end up sinning again. And because they sin again, the cycle happens again. And the sin, servitude, supplication, salvation, silence pattern ends up repeating itself at least 6 times in the book of Judges. And part of the reason it repeats itself is because these judges were actually all over the land of Israel. From Shamgar in the far north to Othniel in the far south, none of these were like a king who ruled over the entire land. They were used of God in their particular locale, their own area, to provide a relative measure of deliverance. But then the sin and the cycles all happens over and over. And actually, several of these judges are living at the same time, and thus we have overlaps among them that produces chronological issues in the book. So in Judges 3, we see that all these various people are living in the land. Amalekites in the south, along with the Philistines and the Jebusites, Perizzites and Hivites and Canaanites. Up in the north, we've got the Phoenicians that were never conquered by the tribe of Asher, the Amorites up there, and the Sidonians. And it's really quite a mess. That is the big picture of the book of Judges. And it's worthy of going through and seeing how each one of these judges actually ruled. I would have to go through them pretty quickly, and I will go through them pretty quickly, like Othniel, for example, who is used of God because Cushan Rishathaim oppresses all of Israel, and God raises up Othniel in the south to rally all the people of Israel against him. And of all the people, Othniel is actually the most admirable of all the judges. He's a righteous man, a godly man, a relative of Caleb himself. He is followed by Ehud, whom God uses to judge the Moabites. And you probably know the story of Ehud, the left-handed man who was able to escape the guards because they wouldn't have searched his right hip, his right thigh, where he would have kept his dagger. And then after Ehud was Shamgar, son of Anath, who rescued Israel. He once killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. Some doubt these sort of things. Really, one man kills 600 men? Friends, there's no way these people could do this apart from God being the one who just lays these Philistines out in front of them. And this is God. I believe this actually happened as it's talking about, but it certainly couldn't have happened without God. When we get into chapter 4, we see the first woman judge, Deborah. Now, Deborah knew that was quite unusual for a woman to be the judge, and Barak was a bit, just kind of not so comfortable about leading the people. She sends for him, Judges 4:4, and she says, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go and take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun up in the north, and lead the way to Mount Tabor." Okay, right there in the north. "And I'm gonna lure Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and troops to the Kishon River and give him into your hands." And she says, "Well, if you'll go with me, I will go. But if you won't go with me, I won't go." Now, I find it interesting. This is one of the verses people use to say, see, women should be in leadership and all these sort of things. And I kind of go, well, it sounds like she didn't really want to be the leader here. And she says, "Very well, I'll go with you. But because you're going about this, the way you're going about this, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will hand Sisera over to a woman." And I suspect he thought that would be her. As we see the account, 10,000 Israelite men defeat 90 Canaanite chariots. And indeed, the victory goes to a woman, not Deborah herself. But Deborah saw that God had given a great victory, and we see Deborah's song taught to the people in Judges chapter 5, the song of Deborah, about how God brought such a great victory. In Judges 6, we see probably the one that's one of the most familiar to us would be Gideon. And Gideon is called of God in kind of a miraculous ways. And Gideon is a bit like Moses, who's the reluctant leader. And he says, well, Lord, if you just make the fleece wet and the ground dry, and God does it, and God, if you just flip it around, let's make the fleece dry and the ground wet, and God mercifully does it. And he thanks God for the miracle of the dew, and God uses him. But God says, you've got too many men. You're gonna go into battle, and you're gonna probably take credit for this on your own. And so just trim down your troops. I only want you to take the guys who lap up the water out of their hands. And as it turns out, he actually ends up with only 300 men. 300 men against more than 100,000 enemy. How in the world is he ever going to win like that? Well, the answer is he's not. But God can, and God will. And so he has this amazing victory over the Midianites. And it's quite evident that it was not their strategy, it certainly was not their numbers, but God was the one who gave them the victory. In fact, later on, this battle in Judges is looked back on by Isaiah 9. It says, you'll break the oppressor's rod just as you did when you destroyed the army of Midian, referring to the battle of Gideon, who was able, with such a small force, to actually win the battle. When we get to Judges 9, we see that although Gideon told the people, I refuse to be your king, he had a son. And his son was named Abimelech, or Abimelech. Some of you have had Hebrew, and you can figure out what that means, right? Melech is our Hebrew word for king, and Abi, father. Ab is father, Abi, my father. So here's Gideon saying, I'm not going to be your king, but I'll have a son, and I'll name him my father's king. Guess who that refers to? And here we see these, Abimelech himself was really a pain, really a thorn in Israel's side. And Abimelech, some would say he's a judge. I say he's actually the oppressor. And the woman who throws a heavy millstone on the head of Abimelech and kills him is actually the deliverer of Israel. But not everybody agrees with me on that particular one. But we're followed with Tola. We just see a couple verses about him in the first couple verses of chapter 10. We see Jair, not much about him, except he led Israel 22 years, Judges 10, verse 3. And then we see Jephthah, the account focus in on Jephthah against the Ammonites. And Jephthah has an amazing victory against the Ammonites. And even though he was not really an admirable man, God still used him. But he made a stupid vow that whatever would come out of his house, if God gave him the victory, he would offer up to the Lord. And lo and behold, Jephthah's daughter, his only child actually, ended up being the first out of the house. I think he expected an animal that would live in the lower part of the house to go on out of the house. A sheep or something like that he would offer up to God. Oh, he realized how horrible it is to make vows to God. And there's debate, did Jephthah really kill his daughter? Or did he actually have her serve at the temple or the tabernacle the rest of her life? There's pros and cons for either one. I'll leave that up to you. But the bottom line is that he was not able to enjoy the benefit of having his daughter. And she was not able to grow up as most women did, to have children, and Jephthah become a grandfather, and some of the delights of life that came from that. In Judges 12, we see Isban, and then we see Elon, and these men were there up in the north, and Abdon. Not a whole lot about them. But when we get to chapter 13, we see the cycle happen again, and this one we call the Samson cycle. It was sin. It was, again, Israelites did evil in the sight of the Lord. And then what the Lord did is he brought them into servitude, so the Lord handed them over to the Philistines who oppressed them for 40 years. And of course, then the people turned to the Lord with supplication. Well, actually, they didn't. No mention is made of the nation crying out to the Lord for deliverance from its enemy here. In other words, things have gotten so bad, the people aren't even crying out to the Lord anymore. They're so tired of these sin cycles, and they're so caught up in doing things their way, they're not even really turning to the Lord. Sadly, the same thing happens to people today. And so the Lord then said, as the God said to Moses, give the following instruction to the people of Israel. If any of the people, either men or women, take a special vow of the Nazarite, setting themselves apart to the Lord in a special way, they must give up wine and other alcoholic drinks. They must not use vinegar made from wine or other alcoholic drinks, and they must not drink fresh grape juice, and they must not eat grapes or raisins. That was what God said in Numbers 6. As long as they are bound by their Nazirite vow, they are not allowed to eat or drink anything that comes from the grapevine, not even the grape seeds or skins. They must never cut their hair throughout the time of their vow, for they are holy and set apart unto the Lord. And until the time of their vow has been fulfilled, they must let their hair grow long, and they must not go near a dead body during the entire period of their vow to the Lord. You see all the background here for Samson? The people do not supplicate to the Lord, but God delivers them through Samson, who delivers them through their enemies to the west, the Philistines, as God's merciful provision for the nation. Interestingly, the name Samson, it means son. So here's a man who actually is about as dark as the judges come, but ironically his name is Son. He is about as bad and sometimes even worse than the Philistines whom he was delivering Israel from. And so Samson, his ministry is to the west, to the judge. He's one of the judges, as we see in Judges 14. And he's caught up in the same kind of immorality that is true of the people of the land. Judges 14:1. One day when Samson was in Timnah, one of the Philistine women caught his eye. And when he returned home, he told his father and mother, a young Philistine woman in Timnah caught my eye. I want to marry her. Get her for me. Is there any consideration here that this woman is a pagan? She's worshiping Dagon, the false god of the Philistines? It doesn't seem to matter to Samson at all. There they go. And as Samson and his parents were going down to Timnah, a young lion suddenly attacked Samson near the vineyards of Timnah. And at that moment, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, and he ripped the lion's jaws apart with his bare hands. He did it as easily as if it were a young goat, but he didn't tell his father or mother about it. Yeah. Well, Samson's a man after the flesh, a man of revenge. And he wants to go to his wife's room, sleep with her. They wouldn't let her. The father wouldn't let her in. He says, no, I gave her to marriage to your best man. Chapter 15. And Samson's so enraged by this, he goes and catches 300 foxes, sets their tails on fire, and burns up all the grain of the Philistines to the ground. And then he takes a jawbone, and in revenge, with this jawbone, kills these numerous Philistines. And he's just a man basically about as bad as the men that he's trying to deliver Israel from. In chapter 16, he stayed in bed only till midnight when he's with Delilah, and then he got up, took a hold of the doors of the town, lifted them up, put them on his shoulders, took them all away. I mean, can you imagine lifting the doors that are designed to keep out the enemies from a town, and he picks them up and puts them on his shoulders and carries them up to the top of the hill? But there was a Delilah in his life. And Delilah was the one who was able to find out the secret of his strength. Or you might say what his actual weakness was. So what was Samson's weakness? Was it his hair? Was that his weakness? Or was it her? Was it hair or her? Chuck Swindoll says Samson was the he-man with a she weakness. I think there's maybe some truth in that, because he's all caught up, like many of us men. No other man, nothing could conquer us except a woman. And you can tell me the stories, and I can tell you the stories of godly men whom Satan couldn't get to them. Well, one pretty woman could. I don't think it was actually his hair or her that was his greatest weakness. His greatest weakness was his heart. And because his heart was not in tune totally with the Lord, therefore he became weak in relationship to women, Delilah in particular, and then he ended up showing her that the secret of his strength was the fact that he had such long hair. So he gets a haircut. First haircut. And the haircut leads to an eyes cut. And then the eyes cut leads to Samson being imprisoned until he has one last chance for vengeance against the Philistines, and he kills himself along with 3,000 Philistines. So he is the means of salvation for the people. He killed more people in the day of his death than the rest of his life. But Samson had judged Israel for 20 years, and there's actually no mention made of the nation experiencing any peace after this 20 years. There's 20 years. There's no period of silence, where because of all this, they ended up really getting their act together. And I think for us, the idea here is that we go in circles when we make up the rules. Some of us could give personal testimony to that in our lives. Wow. Repeated cycles tell us the only thing we learn from history is we don't learn anything from history. Is your commitment to Christ cyclical? That's what this book is actually asking us. Are you like fickle Israel that just goes in and out of fellowship with the Lord? We've all seen it happen. The people are at church for a few weeks, and then you don't see them for a year, and then they show up another year or two later, and so many people live like that because they don't have that consistency. So how can you stop the cycles? I would say you got to go back to the source every day. Otherwise, you're going to get caught up in the cycles. You get caught up in moral relativism. Relativism is when we really don't have our feet in the Lord. My friend who taught through this book with me, Dr. Andrew Spurgeon, who has taught some of you, we called the series Band-Aids on a Gunshot Wound. You got a really big problem, a gunshot wound, and what do you do with it? You just put a little Band-Aid over it. That's basically what Israel did in the period of the Judges. They didn't deal with the real sin. They didn't take the bullet out. They didn't get real healing. And so why must you be steadfast in having God as your king? Well, today we've seen so far two reasons to place our trust in him as king. Incomplete obedience plants the seeds for failure, and then relativism leads to cycles of sin. But there's also a third one that the book of Judges tells us as well in terms of this question: why must you be steadfast to have God as king? And that is this third principle: relativism leads to idolatry. Did you catch that? If you have a relative standard, if you don't have absolute standards, you're going to end up in idolatry. If you follow your whims instead of God's wisdom, then you're going to worship a different God. In fact, the God you worship will just change throughout the stages of life. You've seen it happen. I've seen it happen. Israel's religious and moral failures showed they needed a righteous king instead of their relativism. They needed a king who would teach them based on the Word of God and make sure that others were investing in them, the Word of God. And what we end up seeing in the cycles of the Judges is it's not just a cycle over and over that stays the same. It's a cycle that continues to go downward. Othniel was the most righteous of all the judges, but by the time we get to Samson, they're really, really in trouble. And the numbers of years of that they have peace, actually, I find it interesting. Early on in their history here in the period of the Judges, they have 5 times as many years of peace, or 4 times as many years of peace as they do of oppression. After Othniel and Ehud, they have 8 years of oppression and 40 years of peace. That's a lot more peace than oppression, right? And under Ehud, they're oppressed for 18 years, but they have 80 years of peace. That sounds, well, not too bad. And then it gets to be only 40 years of peace after 20 years of oppression. By the time you get to the end of the Judges, you have a whole lot more oppression than you do peace. Under Jephthah, they have 18 years of oppression, but they're only 6 years of peace. It's not looking good. By the time we get to Samson, they're oppressed for a whole generation and a half, 40 years, and they only have 20 years of peace. And it's kind of like that with a lot of our lives. We don't follow God's standards, and we end up in this relativism, and things get worse and worse and worse and worse. And it becomes the exception rather than the rule to really be consistent with the Lord. So Judges 17 to 21 tells us this horrible part of the Bible, that with the need for a monarchy because they're just absolutely depraved. There's a religious depravity that moves into a moral depravity. It starts with religious failure. The personal apostasy of a man named Micah in chapter 17, who tells his mother, the 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from you, about which I heard you utter a curse. Well, I have that silver with me. I took it. In other words, Mom, I stole from you. And she says, oh, the Lord bless you, my son. Really? God bless you? And so she takes the 1,100 shekels of silver back, and she says, I solemnly consecrate my silver to the Lord for my son to make a carved image and a cast idol. Now, the right reaction to this is you're supposed to look at this and kind of shake your head. What? Your thanks to God is shown in you carving an idol, a silver idol? That's how bad it got. Where they thought they were doing something good for God, but they're actually caught up in idolatry against God. Sad to say, you've seen it, and I've seen it. Many people think they're serving the Lord, but they're actually caught up in idolatry. They even hire a Levite. Nice to have a Levite, but they hire him as a pagan priest. Since when does a Levite supposed to be a priest for one family of Micah? That's how bad things got in terms of their religious failure. Continues in chapter 18, because there's tribal apostasy. The Danites are looking for a place to live. They haven't conquered their area. And so they come by And the Levite blesses the selfish, faithless migration plan of the Danites. And the Danites seize him and say, hey, it's better for you to be a priest of a tribe, a whole tribe, rather than just for one man. So they steal him, and they have a syncretistic, in other words, they're mixing paganism with the worship of God. They say they're worshiping the Lord, Yahweh, the true God. And that religious failure that we see in chapter 17 and 18 ends up leading to moral failure. Does it not happen the same today? I mean, if you have a religious failure, it's just a matter of time. When you've got idolatry in your life, it's just a matter of time before you have moral failure. Where a society ends up becoming like my society. And I would estimate among the people that I know in the United States, 80% of them live with the person before they end up getting married. That turning away from the Lord leads to a moral and an immoral lifestyle as a result. And there's no foundation in there. Churches are struggling with this. How do we deal with people who are living together, having sex outside of marriage, and that they're coming to our church? This kind of thing is happening all over the Western world, and it's making its way into Asia as well. The moral failure here also happens in the sexual realm. The Benjamites in Gibeah actually rape and kill a Levite's concubine. Here is one of the most gross passages you'll find in the Bible. They kill a concubine is killed. She's cut into 12 pieces. And then the pieces of her body are sent all throughout the land. I'll spare you all the details, but that's the essential idea here. So there's rape, there's murder, and it all comes to a head where 400,000 people of the other tribes say, let's go get these people that would do such a horrible thing, these people of Benjamin. And so all the tribes gather together to go against the Benjamites. One city of Benjamin, actually the city of Gibeah, but the other Benjamites say, you're not going to get one of our cities. So we have one tribe against the other 11 tribes, and it is not a pretty picture. The 400,000 basically wipe out the Benjamites, with the exception of just a few hundred, 400, 600, 400 virgins, 200. There's about 600 Benjamites left. And so they have a carnal plan to provide wives for them because the rest of the tribes say, I can't believe we did this. We almost wiped out a whole tribe of Israel. And it ends with the last verse. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. Quite a fitting summary of really what we have in the book of Judges, is it not? I think that the idea here is to be guided by wisdom. And where are you going to get that wisdom? But the Word of God. An absolute standard. Be guided by wisdom instead of whims that worship a different God. Replacing God's wisdom with personal whims is idolatry. Jesus said it well, no one can serve two masters. And apostasies, bitter fruits become political disintegration, tribal hostility, social chaos, increased immorality, disregard of the law, anarchy. And what we find here is that this idolatry, which often is making a good thing the ultimate thing, oftentimes idolatry is not completely wrong. It's just oftentimes it's taking something good and making it the ultimate thing. It ends up becoming horrendous. Making sex the most important thing in your life. Even redefining marriage is a sign of idolatry. It's a sign of, there's another standard here. So why must you be steadfast in having God as your king? I would sum up the book of Judges with this simple statement: make God king. Not relativism and the idolatry of sin cycles. In other words, be steadfast with the Lord. That's what I mean by make God king. Oh, he's already king. But can you and I be steadfast in believing him to be king? So you don't have to fail over and over again. That's not making relativism and idolatry of sin cycles a reality in your own life. So make God king, not relativism and the idolatry of sin cycles. We have seen that incomplete obedience plants the seeds for failure, and that relativism comes about, leads to cycles of sin, and then the relativism leads to idolatry. I think it's good for us to discuss and think through, and those that are watching this on YouTube, I would encourage you to take some time to think through this question. How is our day like the period of the Judges? And I would just encourage you to turn the tape off at this point, discuss this for a while, and then come on back in and finish the session. But I would say for those of us that are here right now, we should be able to see things like relativism. Save the whales. Some of us want to save whales more than we want to save humans. Secularism. I don't let my religion affect my politics. Promiscuity. What a leader does in his own bedroom is his business and not my business. These are some of the ways that we have these very judges-like standards today. This pamphlet is blank, the man says, as the people come to his door or witnessing, and the guys say, well, we're atheists. Don't believe it. Don't believe it that the atheists don't believe anything. That's not the problem with atheism. The problem with atheism is not that they don't believe, that they believe nothing. The problem is that they believe just about anything because they don't believe in God first. And this book tells us rejecting God's lordship plants seeds for failures. So we need to make sure that we follow God's absolute standards. Otherwise, we have cycles of sin. And that eventually is going to lead to idolatry that we see at the end of the book. So be steadfast. And think about it. Who is the real boss of your life? How can you enthrone God as your true king? How can you do as 1 Corinthians 15:58 says, therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain.